Welcome to the Republican Professor podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. It is Tuesday, 11 November 2025, years after Jesus. And we have Helmut Thielicke again joining us. Wonderful guest on the Republican Professor podcast. The last time that we had Helmut on was last year. And we're finishing the chapter in his Theological Ethics, Politics, second volume in his series on foundations. Volume one was Foundations, Theological Ethics. We're in Ideologies as Idolatry, starting on page 46. But before we get there, um, we are, I do have an announcement that this will be the last episode on the Republican Professor podcast before we do the next episode. So there won't be any more episodes on the Republican Professor podcast between this one and the next one. I just wanted to let you know that before the next episode, there won't be any others. So with that announcement out of the way, we do have a reading from the Psalms and Streams in the Desert, and I'm really excited about that. We're going to get to that at the very end. This is also the first recording I'm doing with these AirPods that were donated by a friend of the podcast who wishes to be remain anonymous, I think. I'm not sure, but in any case, thank you. You know who you are. Adam. Page 46. Idolatries as Idolatry. This is Helmut Thielicke, Theological Ethics, Volume 2, Politics. This was published by Fortress Press. We'd like to thank Fortress Press for making this material available. We'd like to thank Helmut Thielicke for writing it. And for Old Capitol Books in Monterey on Alvarado Street for making it available for purchase as a used copy. Of course, they used to be at 559 Tyler in Monterey, back where a long time ago, over a decade and a half ago, it was Haven Books. Remember Haven? I do, right across from Pete's Coffee there. Anyway, thank you to Old Capitol Books. I know they're all a bunch of Marxists and socialists that run that place, ironically, as a small business. But I do have a heart for the lost in Monterey, and have had a heart for the lost in Monterey for 31 years, which is when I moved there in 1993. Gosh, has it been? Well, I guess it's been 32 years now, going on 32 years. Damn, son. Damn, son. Old Capitol Books is fun. It's a fun place. I really love the bookstores, and I went to Monterey Peninsula College. They've seen better days in terms of wokeness, but I'm going to leave it right there. Okay, I'm just going to leave that there. Support your local book dealer. I would have said support your local community college, but guys, higher ed is undergoing some kind of convulsion these days, and I don't understand it. Nobody does. We're just going to have to wait it out. I think we do need to starve it for funds if it deviates in any way from academic excellence, which it does, Mm, which it does. So we got to keep starving until they learn the right lessons. If they do, I don't know if they will. Well, Helmut Thielicke was a professor at the University of Hamburg for many years, guys. And as a professor at the University of Hamburg, he lived through the Nazis. Well, actually, this was before Hamburg, but he has two doctorates, one in philosophy, one in theology. He lived through both kinds of socialism, National Socialism and communistic socialism. And he comes at this from a Christian perspective, politics. I impersonally really like it. Sorry, I'm drinking water. I should have muted myself. Um, it's really warm for November, and I know that people are going to say it's climate change or whatever. I usually say, yeah, about 2.5 nanoseconds after the Big Bang, it was 79 degrees in San Diego. It's been that way ever since. Um, you know, that's the way it should be. The way it was is the way it should be. And was and is and should are all mean the same thing in biology. So I'm being facetious, FYI. Here we go. Idolatries as it, it, uh, ideologies as idolatry. This is the pragmatism and idolatry of the ideologies. Picking right up from where we left off, the last section was ideology and law. The one before that was ideology and science. Those were published as episodes on the Republican Professor podcast in fall of 2024. Let's continue, shall we? The statement that ideology is in its very nature pragmatic and that it pragmatizes all spheres of life which it claims, and it claims them all, involves a theological judgment. We have intimated that this already in our previous analysis. Indeed, says Helmut Thielicke, we're going to do a fair use of this, do a transformative reading. We're making a fair use doing a transformative reading of Helmut Thielicke. Indeed, the theological judgment constituted the criterion for that analysis. Our task now is to give that final judgment, give that judgment final and explicit formulation. We have 5 main points. First, the norm for all thought and action is not an authority binding upon man, but a specific interest determined by man himself. Hmm. Amen, brother. Amen. Sorry about that. I had to I just turned the air on. It was getting too warm in here. Trying to stay hydrated here, buddy. So 5 main points. First, we're on page 47 at the top. The norm for all thought and action is not an authority binding upon man, but a specific interest determined by man himself. Man, therefore, in the communist view, man, therefore, in the communist view, man is representative of the class, is lord of all. Since all life is determined by its environment, and environmental factors can be shaped by man, literally, as the kids say, literally. He can't believe he used that word literally. I don't know. I'm refocusing my appreciation for Helmut after using the word literally like that. Literally, everything falls within man's capacity to create, including those characteristics of man, animals, and plants which are transmitted hereditarily. The dominion of man is thus the rightful successor to the creatorship of God. It is an imitation of the divine doxa. Second, the man thus filled with the passion to create, however, is not only one who makes, he is himself made. He is manipulated as an object. He is not an active participant in the sense of having a personal autonomy of his own. He is simply a functionary having no will of his own or a passive fellow worker or even a sacrificial offering. A personal being who resists such depersonalization cannot be tolerated, and that for two reasons. In the first place, the person who makes independent decisions cannot be fully integrated into the apparatus of the power structure. He cannot be used like a tool because he has his reservations, voices his criticisms, and pursues his own goals. Potentially, at least, he is always an opponent, and that potential is actualized all too often. The ideologist has control over the category of the dynamic. Thus, it follows that for him, the quote person can only be, it's got quotes around the word person, can only be a counterforce or obstacle. This is the communist, the socialist. He's going to talk about National Socialism and communistic socialism as really the same monster. Socialism, totalitarianism. Remember, he lived through it, guys. He lived through this. Speaking from experience, he's got two PhDs, one in philosophy, one in theology. Let's continue. Thus, it follows that for him, the quote person unquote can only be a counterforce or obstacle. This is why the quote person unquote cannot be allowed to exist. He must be absorbed in the collective. This is Helmut Thielicke, Theological Ethics, Volume 2, Politics, Communism, Revolution, Nuclear Weapons, War, Conscientious Objection, Welfare, Power, Law and Morality, Disobedience. It's not just communism, it's National Socialism as well. Both sides of socialism, the problem. Then, in the second place, since the concept of the personal does not exist in ideological thinking, man is never anything but the representative of a class or social group. Oh my gosh, you see this all the time. You hear this term underrepresented, blah, 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 on college campuses all the time. I always say on these sites like Chronicle of Higher Education or whatever it is that they're talking about, I always say, students don't represent anybody but themselves on campus and their best work. And even then, they don't represent themselves and their best work. They simply present themselves and their best work. Ideally, it's their best work. This isn't Congress, it's education. They're not representing anybody else. And they're not even representing themselves, they're presenting themselves. So that's why he says, in the second place, since the concept of the personal does, that's why there's no personal responsibility in the socialist view. That's why there's so much grade inflation. How could there be how could there be personal responsibility and grade inflation at the same time? Since the concept of the personal does not exist in ideological thinking, Man is never anything but the representative of a class or social group. Any appeal to a man's moral or intellectual conscience is merely a cover up for another appeal, the true appeal, which is to a certain class interest. As the ideologist sees it, there can be no appeal to something which binds men unconditionally. There is only the appeal to the dictates of interest. The ideologist not only understands himself pragmatically, he credits all others with the same motivation. Page 48. Third, Christianity, therefore, is not an allegiance to God as ultimate authority. It is merely another ideological expression of a particular social situation. Okay, now he's not saying that he believes this. Okay. Uh, how did this? He's saying, remember on page 46, he says, the statement that ideology is in its very nature pragmatic and that it pragmatizes all spheres of life which it claims, and it claims them all, involves a theological judgment. So what he's saying is these secular people that parade around as call themselves socialists, they're very religious. He says on page 47, we have intimated this already in our previous analysis. Indeed, the theological judgment constituted the criterion for that analysis. Our task now is to give that judgment final and explicit formulation. We have five main points, and we're on the third point right now. By the way, who's he citing in the footnotes? Wyszynski, and I can't even read that. It's in German. Andrei Wyszynski, and it's Moscow, 1949. East Berlin, 1952. Professor Polyansky, it's in German. V.I. Lenin, at the conclusion of his address, April 29th, 1918. Berlin, 1960. Mao Zedong on the People's Democratic Dictatorship, Peiping, English Language Service of the New China News Agency, Xinhua. She. Oh, Zhongshan Xinhua She, 1949. Peiping, it's Beijing. Hmm. Mao Zedong. Hmm. Okay, well, he's quoting communists in the original, not in Chinese. He can't read Chinese, I don't think, but he's quoting communists in the original. So when he says, third, Christianity is therefore not an allegiance to God as ultimate authority on page 48 at the top. It is merely another ideological expression of a particular social situation. He's saying that's how the religious secular person views it, the socialist. In two senses, then, ideology is anti-Christian. Now that's his view, right? It is so, first, in relation to the Christian, for it has to regard his allegiance to Christ as a contesting and truncating of its own claim to allegiance, and hence as opposition. It is so, second, in relation to Christianity, not merely because Christianity is something which seeks to bind and enslave the Christian, but also because, as an ideology, Christianity represents an outmoded stage of class development. This is according to the communist, the socialist, the national socialist, the Nazi. Hence, or fascist, however you want to say it. Hence, I think I've made clear that fascism and socialism, two sides of the same coin, according to Helmut Thielicke. Okay, and I agree with that. They're both on the left. Both on the left. We did a whole video about this, whole episode about this. What is left? What is right? Just look it up. That's the title of it. I think it was spring of 2024. Uh, okay, Christianity represents an outmoded stage of class development. Hence, from the standpoint of materialistic thinking, there you go, Christianity is one, untrue. From the dynamic standpoint, it is two, a hostile authority. And from the historical standpoint, it is three, reactionary, in as much as it represents a religious ideological superstructure which is no longer in step with the base, the contemporary social situation. From this, further theological consequences necessarily follow. Fourth, within the framework of ideologies, I think I've said that I don't like that word ideology, but we're going to use his word. Within the framework of ideologies, the word degenerates. For the word draws its life from the fact that what it expresses is an ultimate reality. The word is the medium of confession. And this fact of its origin lives on in all other forms of utterance, whether it be a word that informs and so is related to ultimate truth, or a word that gives shape and so is related to ultimate being, or a word that expresses judgment and so it is related to ultimate righteousness. The word also draws its life from the fact that it establishes and expresses or ruptures and puts to an end communication between persons. It's talking about the word. In Greek, the word translates, the English word translates in the Gospel of John, early chapter, logos, logic, where we get the word logic. Within the framework of ideologies, the word degenerates, for the word draws its life from the fact that what it expresses is an ultimate reality. The word is the medium of confession, and this fact of its origin lives on in all other forms of utterance, whether it be a word that informs, gives shape, or a word that expresses judgment. And these are philosophical significance, ultimate truth, ultimate being, ultimate righteousness. The word also draws its life from the fact that it establishes and expresses or ruptures and puts an end to communication between persons. Its power to maintain and dissolve fellowship extends from the lover's pledge of faithfulness to the judge's sentence of death. Where the word no longer has anything to say, where it has lost its ultimate reference, and where the word is no longer a medium of communication, there being no persons left to do the communicating, it necessarily loses its force. This is why communists always go after language as a useful tool of communication. They undermine it with slogans, lies, deception, so on and so forth. Just read 1984. Read Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Read The Last Bolshevik by, what's that guy's name? NYU Press, 1969, I believe. We should do that one on the podcast. I mean, just read communist stuff, man. Read it. None dare call it treason. Read Fred Schwartz on You Can Trust a Communist to be a Communist. Read the director of FBI has one, Masters of Deceit, J. Edgar Hoover. I know he's controversial, but shoot, he's covering people that are controversial too. He knew a lot about communists, a lot. When the word has lost its reference to norms and to persons, then in spite of whatever continuing tactical goals and relevance to material facts it might have, as used, e.g., by an engineer, it has become a word without a real purpose, a word which, like the ideology in which it has its origin, can have only dynamic interests. There's a footnote. Friedrich Engels on the history of early Christianity. Karl Marx. He's quoting Marxists. Yeah, page 49 at the top. In a basic sense, it is simply the expression of power, the stuff which with which power operates. This may be seen particularly in that which is the normal form of the word as the ideologies use it, namely propaganda. Propaganda is really the decisive instrument whereby an ideology exercises its power, which is why it is used to an extraordinary degree in the totalitarian state. Okay, there's a footnote. In The Rains Came, Louis Bromfield shows the degree to which the Western democracies have, quote, come to be the propagandists par excellence, and so taken on ideological features. That's interesting. Okay. George Orwell has unforgettably portrayed the omnipresence of the dictator in his 1984. Oh, he's actually interacting with our American and so-called Western democracies. So we're not immune to this, guys. In the quote West, we're the attraction to socialism is in human nature. It's going to be there. It's going to be a continual thing. You got to be aware of it. You got to study it. You got to study it like a carpenter studies how to build a a cabinet. I mean, there's a way to there's something to study, my point, and there's something to get better at. You got to study it as if it's something to get better at. Um, uh, Propaganda is really the decisive instrument whereby an ideology exercises its power, which is why it is used to an extraordinary degree in the totalitarian state, e.g., through broadcasts and banners, appeals to the eye and to the ear, which bombard the individual from all sides at all times, smothering him with signals and affecting the omnipresence of the ideology. The word of propaganda is unable to persuade. That is not its purpose. Mm, mm. Quite apart from its inherent incapacity, it is simply too shallow and empty to do so. Okay, there's a footnote there. We are thinking of the banners everywhere displayed on buildings, in shop windows, and along the streets in communist countries. Remember, he's in University of Hamburg, which is in West Germany. The author, Helmut Thielicke, professor of theology at the University of Hamburg in Germany, is a frequent lecturer at Drew, Princeton, Chicago, Houston, Berkeley, and other universities and seminaries. So, I mean, he was kind of like swimming in the liberal Protestant world, but uh, what remember when Democrats used to be concerned about communism? Do you remember that? I know it's hard to remember. Um, but let's keep going, okay? Let's keep going. It is intended only to load down the psyche. This is propaganda. It is intended only to load down the psyche. Be careful, guys, with your scrolling, with your constant feeding your attention, overloading your attention span. Be careful. Get books. Did you know that this physical book, has no ads? It's just me in the book. There's no signals going through my brain when I read this book from some kind of device. I'm a little bit nervous about these AirPods because I don't know what's going into my brain, man, and I don't know what these things are doing when I have them put away. Are they recording something or are they listening? I don't know. It's a little creepy. Anything without a wire. I like wearing a wire. I might go back. I'm just trying this out, but don't think I'm paranoid. I'm not paranoid. I'm just careful. I'm just careful. These people are crazy, man. So avoid overdoing the psyche. Avoid loading down the psyche. So it's saying the propaganda, it is intended only to load down the psyche, page 49, to make dents and impressions, to exercise the power of suggestion by way of endless and unvaried repetition. This is marketing. This is commercials. This is ads. That's what propaganda is. This is so good. I used to teach business ethics for over a decade, and I was always just so nervous when we get to certain topics about the use of words in business to persuade people to buy something that they don't really want or need. Lord, help us. Lord, please help us get back to basics. Help us remember the purpose of why we're here, to contribute to human flourishing. Lord, help us find what's not contributing, what's making things worse. Help us make it better. Help us serve your creation, creatures made in the image of God. Help us create healthy options for people deviating from your wise design. Help us when we are so tempted to deviate, Lord. Help us fight the communists without becoming monsters. Help us be instruments of your redemption. Help us not be so shallow and empty like these communists and their propaganda. May we genuinely see each other as persons. Page 49. Propaganda. It's intended only to load down the psyche, to make dents and impressions, to exercise the power of suggestion by way of endless and unvaried repetition. Such a word does not persuade, it pummels. It is not meant to convince, but to smite. It is a slogan. As we have suggested already, it has a purely dynamic function. In two ways, the slogan is indicative of depersonalization. First, the one who wields it regards the one against whom it is wielded not as a person, but as an object, a force to be either captured and integrated into his own power potential or else destroyed as a hostile power, but in either case, a force and not a person. Second, the slogan strikes a man not at the personal center where he makes up his mind, but only at the extremities of his nervous system. It operates with visual and audial stimulants. When fellowship between persons and even personal fellowship within a group is broken, there no longer exists that stratum of the ego in which convictions can be formed. Indeed, where centers of personal autonomy still exist, the effort is to do away with them because the more there is of personal substance, the greater is the immunity to manipulation through external stimuli. And the more there is of independent reflection and inspiration, the stronger is the resistance to impression through the senses. The more there is of independent reflection and inspiration, the stronger is the resistance to impression through the senses. Page 50. This is what leads Simone Weil to rightly to observe propaganda is not directed toward creating an inspiration. It closes, seals up all the openings through which an inspiration might pass. It fills the whole spirit with fanaticism. The Need for Roots. I have that book, page 51, 187. Developed personal fellowships accordingly are atomized. The collective is not a fellowship at all, but a conglomeration of unrelated particles no longer connected to one another by any norms. Paradoxically, the collective is just another form, the collective form of isolation. The members of the collective, unrelated to one another as persons, have in common only that sphere which is below the level of the ego, namely the nerves. There is a certain homogeneity only because their nervous systems are all affected by the same influences and permeated by the same stream of propaganda. Jeez. Man, he's nailing this. He is nailing this. That's why there's so much trauma. Unlike personal fellowship, however, this homogeneity does not establish any solid bond. It persists only so long as the nerves are being artificially stimulated from without. The moment the current is turned off, the artificial facade of ostensible fellowship crumbles. The collapse. Now listen, listen up. Page 50. Helmut Thielicke, Theological Ethics, Volume 2, Politics. Fortress Press. We'd like to thank Fortress Press for making this material available. We'd like to thank Helmut Thielicke for writing it. It's edited by William H. Lazarus, and it published in 1969. This copy got it at Old Capitol Books in Monterey. The collapse of National Socialist ideology is the great historical example of this. See, I told you, he's folding in the National Socialists, the Nazis, along with the communists. He sees them as two sides of the same coin. They're both socialists. They're both on the left. Whether you call them left or right, it doesn't really matter because those terms, left and right, what do they really mean? These are just slogans too. Left compared to what? Right compared to what? What are we even talking about? Be careful using these terms because sometimes they're used as placeholders instead of thought. And you want to use the words to convey thought, not to have placeholders where there is no thought and there's no communication. It's just propaganda. Okay, so he says the collapse of the National Socialist ideology is the great historical example of this. Convictions can usually survive disasters, but when the power of suggestion ceases to operate, the result is a disenfranchisement which plunges the victim into a vacuum and shatteringly reveals the centrifugal tendency which was secretly operative within that ostensible fellowship. I kind of wonder if transgenderism is collapsing because it was just a bunch of propaganda, right? Hitting the nerves, but not really persuading. I don't know anybody that's really persuaded that a man dressed up as a girl is a girl all of a sudden. Nobody can be persuaded of that. You can pretend like it's true up to a certain point. My evidence of this, that it might be collapsing, is the Olympics, I think, just decided that there's going to be no more guys dressing up as girls and competing against the girls. You know, A circus crowd is a good example of the atomized homogeneity with which we have been speaking. A host of people varying in age, education, intelligence, wealth, persuasion will tense up, breathe, relax, and plod as one under the stimulus of a high wire act with its taut drama and rolling drums, only to disband a moment later as isolated individuals bearing never a trace of the artificial fellowship which had so recently bound them together without ever really binding them together. Such is the sham fellowship produced by ideological tyranny. How are you liking this prose? I love it. Fifth, to sum up, theologically, ideology has the character of idolatry, and that in two respects. First, in ideology, it is man who sets himself up as Lord and Master. He sets his own goals, enunciating them in the axioms of his ideology. He is the one who has the power both to fix and to realize these goals. Page 51 at the top. This is the chapter, The Pragmatism and Idolatry of the Ideologies. Not my word, ideology. I'm just reading what he wrote. Okay. Hey, and this is chapter 4. There's a chapter coming up, The Individual and the State. Oh, you're going to want to stick around for that. At one and the same time, he is both the inaugurator and the functionary of the forces of life. He has a will to power, and what he wills not in the name of something above him, but only in his own name. This is idolatry. Not only does man contest the existence and authority of the true Lord of all, he even usurps his place, his capital H, referring to God. The idol made by man has no power to judge. It cannot call in question the one who made and worships it, for a reality which is ultimately identical with me cannot, of course, call me into question. The class or collective in which man objectifies himself, in which he finds himself to be reflected in macroscopic form, in which he sees himself as Lord of all, such a class or collective cannot call man in question because it is bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. His use of biblical terminology there is wonderful. The idol is innocuous. This is why the false prophets of the Old Testament and all idolaters are always known by the fact that they have innocuous messages. They bring good tidings alone, whereas the true God is proclaimed by his servants to be the judge of history, capital J, judge, who makes himself known as an adversary in messages of judgment. It's got a footnote there, 1 Kings 22:15, Isaiah 23:9. 28:7, Jeremiah 2:8, 26, 5:31, Jeremiah 2:8 and verse 26, 5 verse 31, 6:13 verses 13 through 14, chapter 23 verse 8, verses 16, 17, chapter 25 verse 25, chapter 21 verse 8, verse 1, Ezekiel chapter 13 verse 1, Micah chapter 3 verse 5, and then there's a German guy. Here's another one, Fyodor Dostoevsky, their brothers Karamazov. That's the next footnote. It is for this reason that the gospel is always bound up with the law and with its challenge. For the gospel is the good news that the divine opposition has been overcome by God himself. Amen, brother. Amen, brother Thielicke. It is for this very reason that the gospel forever calls in question Christianity itself. It is its inner disquiet. The gospel is that which prevents Christianity from becoming merely a religious component of this world, an item fully integrated into the cultural inventory or even an ideology. Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor is a classic example of how the gospel always stands opposed to the perilous attempts made again and again to pragmatize Christianity. The gospel is what keeps Christianity from degenerating into an ideology. The second mark of the acute idolatry of the ideologies consists in the fact that here a creaturely reality is illegitimately elevated to the rank of creator. In the case presently under discussion, the creaturely reality involved is the material base of history, which is, page 52 at the top, regarded as the ultimate source of everything else and is endowed with pseudo-divine qualities. Such a divination of the creaturely always carries with it the seeds of its own disillusion. For a creaturely entity cannot have binding authority over other creaturely entities, that would carry it quite beyond its appropriate sphere of action. Matter is a creaturely entity which cannot envelop such other creaturely entities as spirit or person any more than idealism's divinized spirit can embrace or bind the material basis of existence. The course of the various worldviews over the centuries can be interpreted in terms of a world which at any given time is seen to stand under an aegis of a particular theme. Because this theme has been enunciated by man, it is nothing but a creaturely entity. Though absolutized by man, it is still unable to subordinate itself to the other spheres of creation. The very attempt to do so drives them to revolt. When individuality is deified in terms of personality, the social forces revolt, and when the collectivity is deified, individualism rises up in rebellion. What is often called the law of the pendulum in history, or the polarity of thesis and antithesis, is simply the structure of the rhythms and of the historical process as these are set in motion by idolatry, for example, false absolutization. The idol, as deified creature, disrupts the organism of the creaturely. The members, which can be directed and integrated only by the head, fall apart and run amok when one of them tries to take over the function of the head. A member may suffer from an elephantitis, but that does not make it a head. And members left without direction soon rise up and revolt. To the degree that history is a history of absolutizations, it is also a history of revolutions, of hostile uprising against the pseudo-absolutes which claim lordship. It is ruptured when it is compelled to accommodate within itself the distance which can only obtain between creature and creator. The ideologies form part of this history of idolatry. Hence, they do not fall outside the sphere of the history of revolt. They are, in fact, its most flagrant example. For they not only have the form of a confession, they also raise a claim to power and are armed with an unparalleled machinery to enforce this claim. Footnote 30 is I have dealt with this law of rebellion in my book, Dear Claw, and I don't even, it's in German. I can't read it. The next chapter is chapter 5, the relation of ideological tyranny to the authoritarian state. Revelation 13 as a model of ideological tyranny. Very interesting. He talks about some historical figures and, you know, I think I might skip ahead a little bit. He does talk about Hitler. He talks about the Kaiser. He talks about Carl Schmitt. He talks about National Socialism and Marxism. I don't know. I mean, there's so many good stuff. The nature of the state and the individual is in chapter 9, the phenomenology of the state. I don't know. Should I just go straight through? What do you think? Show of hands, I should just go straight through. Or show of hand if you only have one arm. Not a paid sponsor. I like getting pizza here, using it as a bookmark. It's in Pacific Grove. Or I guess it's in Monterey, but it's near Pacific Grove. All right, guys. I just held up a menu for Gianni's Pizza, one of the places. Okay. I've enjoyed this episode. I think we're going to skip the psalm and the reading from Streams and Desert. I'm a little bit tired. I got to get going here on my next project for today. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. I've been your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today is Tuesday, 11 November 2025, years after Jesus. I just remembered I can get a free In-N-Out burger and fries and a drink today because it's Veterans Day and I'm a veteran. See ya. God bless.